Hello everyone, this is Professor Al Merriam, your instructor in Political Science 2030, American Government, and welcome back again. Today in the supplemental lecture we're going to be talking about the California legislature. You'll recall in the syllabus and during the introduction that this course is supposed to be on American government and American national government and state government as well. That is part of the statutory requirement that in studying American government we also have to study California state government. Unfortunately, just simply because of the volume of the material as well as the current circumstances that we have in terms of distance virtual learning, we cannot accommodate them both as much as we would like. But what I've done is that I have selected to focus on the three branches of state government: the legislature, the executive branch, and the judiciary. I've also posted a short PDF document which covers these three branches of government. And I invite you to read that. It's less than 40 pages or so on all three branches. So we will focus on the California Constitution in the supplemental lecture, the legislature, the executive branch, and the judiciary. So this is the first part of the discussion on the legislative branch of government, and here I shall try to focus as much as possible on the legislative process, which we discussed in the first supplemental lecture on Congress. So here are the supplemental lecture objectives on California government in general, but specifically on the legislature as well. Since this is an introductory course on U.S. and California governments, here we shall focus on the three branches in a comparative sense. So each supplemental lecture will look at Congress and the California State Assembly, the presidency and the California governor's office, and the federal courts and the state judiciary. But these will be three separate supplemental lectures. And principally, we hope to focus on similarities and differences and compare and contrast the institutions. Again, there's a short PDF material that I posted on Blackboard, and I invite you to review that document. First, let's look at the California Constitution. Every governmental structure that we have, both at the national and state level, is based on some constitutional authority, and of course California is no different. So the key thing about the California Constitution, just like the U.S. Constitution created the national government, well, the state government is created by the state constitution, not by the federal constitution. The federal constitution is exclusively concerned with the national institutions or national branches of government. And so all governmental authority in terms of the functions of the state originate in the state constitution. And California has one of the longest constitutions in the world. It is certainly more detailed than the U.S. Constitution, which is about 7,600 words, and California's constitution has over 40,000 words. And much of that includes amendments, propositions, constitutional amendments that have been referenda passed by the voters, a whole bunch of, and even some things that properly belong in legislation as opposed to constitutional language. As you will note in our study of the U.S. Constitution, the language of the U.S. Constitution is broad and general, and specific areas. Even where it grants specific powers, it does so in a manner that will allow for greater interpretation and flexibility. But here you have a pretty detailed Constitution. Now, like its federal counterpart, the California Constitution is the supreme law of the land in the state, which means that the acts of the state legislature, the courts, the regulatory agencies, whatever institutions there are, the police, the county governments, the local city governments, whatever, they are subject to the state constitution as the supreme law of the land. In other words, no actions or laws or regulations can be passed or performed in violation of the language of the state's constitution, which is another way of saying that the state laws, regulations, rules, and so forth cannot conflict with the state constitution. Now, the California Constitution is much more detailed than the U.S., as I indicated, which is principally focused on 3 branches of national government. However, the California Constitution goes much beyond that. It sets the 3 branches of state government. Then it includes important personal rights and liberties, including the right to privacy and even the right to fish in public streams, which is kind of interesting. And of course, comparatively speaking, the U.S. only has the first 8 amendments, or the first 10 amendments, which is the Bill of Rights, which we covered in Chapter 4. Interestingly, in contrast to the U.S. Constitution, the California Constitution provides for direct democracy, as you know. The U.S. Constitution provides for only one kind of representation, and that is representative democracy or representative government, which means only the people who are elected to be representatives of the people in Congress have the power to make decisions, certainly the authority to enact laws. But here, the California Constitution provides for direct democracy, which means the people actually get involved in making laws. And those laws we see in terms of initiatives, which we've seen recently, just last week, on various issues, including Prop 22 having to do with the right of drivers serving Uber and Lyft and other similar outfits. A referendum is basically a law passed by the state legislature, and it is presented to the people to decide whether or not that law should remain or should be repudiated. And so again, the people actually express their preferences, express their voices, and determine whether or not a law passed by the legislature can stand. Again, this does not mean that every law that has been passed by the state legislature has to go before the voters. It just some controversial issues, some very important issues are presented to the voters to decide. But in 99.9% of all legislative activities, it is the representatives who've been elected to the state legislature who make those kinds of decisions. And of course, the third aspect of it is the power of recall given to voters, which is basically that if voters meet certain kinds of statutory requirements, they could effectively recall an elected official in state government. Recall simply means that that person will no longer serve. In other words, they will withdraw their consent. Of course, there's no such thing as withdrawing consent from a U.S. representative or a senator or any other national office, but this offers popular control or popular decision-making over certain kinds of activities within the state. Now, as I said, the California Constitution covers a whole lot of things beyond the kinds of things that we discussed in the U.S. Constitution, and some of them, as I suggested earlier, should be dealt with in ordinary legislation. In other words, the kind of routine matters that the state legislature would enact. But here in the Constitution are included such topics as the environment, the educational system, water and marine resources, taxation and transportation revenues, labor relation laws, states workers' compensation system, and a whole bunch of other similar kinds of things. And that's why the Constitution exceeds over 40,000 words. It includes so many things, which normally would not be part of a constitutional a constitution. The U.S. Constitution, of course, limits the scope of powers of the national government, and the aim, of course, with the state constitution is similar. Unfortunately, there's so many other provisions in the Constitution, such as the environment, educational systems, and things of that sort, that the power of the state government to legislate in these areas is also pretty vast. The California Constitution, the one that we have now, is a function of progressive era reforms, and that was a progressive movement between perhaps 1890s to the 1920s, which emerged as a response to governmental corruption at the state level. And in California, the railroads were the dominant political actors in causing distrust of elected officials. And the progressive reforms of the state's constitution minimized overall office holder discretion and allowed citizens direct access to creating state laws and even amending the state constitution. And of course, by giving the voters that kind of direct access, we now have a very a large constitution with all kinds of things included in it. And you will note that the California Constitution has been amended over 500 times. The U.S. Constitution in over 233 years has been amended only 27 times. And in that, the first 10 amendments were implemented in 1791, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment in 1868 after the Civil War, and the rest of them after that. So it is exceedingly hard to amend the U.S. Constitution, but obviously, as you can see, the California Constitution has been amended over 500 times. And the amendment process is also pretty straightforward. Unlike the U.S. Constitution, which requires a resolution from Congress or a proposal from the states, and then ratification by 3/4 of the states and so forth. I mean, very complicated process and time-consuming. Here in the state constitution, that could be amended by a simple majority vote through the initiative process. And constitutional amendments, of course, are changes to one or more provisions of the Constitution. And amendments are limited to non-substantial changes, and if a substantial change is required, meaning that if sections of the Constitution have to be changed, then that would require 2/3 majority of both houses of the legislature and a majority vote of the people. Again, so the distinction here is between just minor non-substantial changes and major changes, which would require constitutional revision and then involve 2/3 majority of both houses and a majority vote of the people. Of course, if the equivalent of a constitutional revision for the U.S. Constitution would be a constitutional convention, such as the one that occurred in 1787. In other words, the whole thing is open for change, and that is very unlikely to occur. Now let's look at just the structural arrangement of the constitutional arrangement of the national and state governments. Here, as you can see, is pretty straightforward. You have 3 branches of government. Under the legislative branch is Congress, collectively called Congress, but having a bicameral body, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And under the executive, we have the president, the vice president, and the cabinet. Excuse me. And of course, the judicial branch, which has the constitutionally designated Supreme Court and the other federal courts created by Congress. Pretty straightforward, pretty clean arrangement. Now, if you look at the structure of the government of the United States, you'll notice here that at the very top of this chart is the Constitution, which creates the 3 branches, and each branch has its own subunits. So under the legislative branch, you have Congress and the Senate, but under the Senate and the House, you have a whole bunch of other offices: Architect of Congress, the Botanic Garden, Library of Congress, and so forth. And similarly, under the executive branch, you have the president and vice president, and in the executive office of the president, you have a number of offices, including the White House office, National Security Council, Office of Policy Development, and a number of others as well. And then over in the judicial branch, since the Constitution under Article 3 creates only the Supreme Court, Congress has created all kinds of other courts that are lower than the Supreme Court. That includes the U.S. Court of Appeals, the various district courts, which basically do the trial work in federal cases, territorial courts, courts of international trade, federal claims, and so on and so forth. Tax court, and U.S. Sentencing Commission. So that kind of gives you a sense of that. And of course, directly, this is the yellow part here in the center, under the executive branch, you find all of the federal departments, beginning with the Department of Agriculture down to the Department of Veteran Affairs. These are the departments of government that are responsible for specific areas of policy. And then independent establishments, including independent agencies and so forth, are far and many, and they are listed below. And they come, of course, under one of these executive departments, as you can see here. Now, I'll contrast that with California government, which is quite different from the national one. Here you have, naturally, you have the three branches of government. You have the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. But if you look closely at each branch, for instance, the executive branch, you find that you have the governor, lieutenant governor, the secretary of state. By the way, that's not the same Secretary of State at the national level, which deals with foreign policy. The Secretary of State at the state level deals with such things as incorporations, managing elections, and things of that sort. Then you have the Superintendent of Public Instruction, the Attorney General of the State Controller's Office or Controller, the Treasurer, and Insurance Commissioner. What is interesting about the executive branch is that these are all independently elected constitutional officers. But I mean, the lieutenant governor may or may not be of the same party as the governor, because he or she would have run independently. And if they're elected, then that's what they would retain. The same with the attorney general and so forth. Of course, in the national government, it's the president who would appoint the key federal officials, such as the U.S. Attorney General. U.S. Attorney General is not an independent office, or the Attorney General, whoever seeks that office, does not run for election. That is a political appointment. And then here we have in the legislative branch, we have the state senate and the assembly. And similarly, in the judicial branch, at the very top of the court system is the California Supreme Court, which has which is the final word on all state constitutional issues, not federal, state constitutional issues. And then the courts of appeal, which is below the Supreme Court, and then the superior courts, which are the state's trial courts, and the judicial council, which does a number of things in managing the judicial branch. Again, as you can see, under the executive branch, the responsibilities are listed. For the governor, signs bills into law or vetoes them, appoints judges, proposes state budget, calls state militia, and so forth, and also oversees California state agencies, and essentially runs the executive branch. In many respects, even though some of these executive branch officers are independently led. Similarly, under state legislation, we'll look at these in some detail. The state legislature passes bills, sets the state budget, deals with the state taxes, and has the power to override vetoes and the judicial branch, in much the same way as the federal judicial branch, interprets and applies the law and the state constitution, provides for settlement of disputes, and protects individual rights. So if we focus on the structure of state government, this is again what you would see. It's a more exploded view of what we had seen. And so at the very top are the sovereigns, the people who with the ultimate power, and that is the voters. And as you can see, the voters basically populate these three branches, and ultimately, because these are elected offices, they're all accountable to the voters or to the people. So the voters are the people. Now, legislatures vary from state to state. Many of the larger states with the larger population and so on, such as California, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, have full-time, high-paying, large-staff professional legislatures. In other words, this is a job that they do. This is their day job, as it were. And therefore, they are in session throughout the year. But that is not so for many other states, smaller states, that do not really need a full-time legislature and have a part-time legislature which comes together every year or every other year and legislates and deals with issues and problems for a limited number of months, maybe 3 months or so, and then they go home and they will not be back until later, unless, of course, for some special emergency, they're called back to consider some emergency measure proposed by the governor. The California legislative calendar, the state legislature meets in a 2-year session that is tied to the elections cycle, and these are referred to as regular sessions. And so that's the regular cycle. Then you may have a special session where the governor may call the legislature for a specific purpose, which means that because the California legislature operates continuously throughout the year, with the exception of holidays and recess and things of that sort, they cannot stop and consider some legislation by the governor because they are in regular session. So in order for them to consider some special issue or problem that the governor has called to their attention, the governor will have to call a special session of the legislature, which means that they will stop whatever else they're doing and consider the measure presented to them by the governor. And laws enacted by the California legislature do not take effect immediately. Oftentimes, in the vast majority of cases, they take effect on January 1 of the following year. So it's the new year when these laws become active. And the reason for that, of course, is that people will have ample time to be notified of changes and what new laws have been in place. And that makes for better public information and better compliance with the law as well. Now let's take a look at the California political trends given the election we just had a week ago. 2020 produced probably a record turnout, and of course because of COVID, a significant number or significant percentage of the ballots were returned by mail, some 11.8 million by mail. There are about 22 million registered voters, of which 12 million voted in 2020, and of those almost 11.8 million of them voted by mail. So there were no long lines at the polls this year. Also, voter registration was up in California, and that also showed that the share of voters identifying themselves as Democrats and Independents had similarly increased. And most independent voters likely lean towards the majority party. Another trend that we can detect is that the ideological and partisan divides in the California voter population is as stark as it could be. There's quite a bit of ideological and partisan division. People pretty much sticking to their set of issues. The likely voters in California are disproportionately white, and Democratic likely voters are more diverse as well. So that's kind of the bird's eye view of political voting trends in California. And here you have voter party affiliations, a chart that kind of gives you a breakdown by political ideology, strength of affiliation among major party voters, major party leanings among independent voters, race, ethnicity, gender, education, income, and so forth. So if you look at this chart here, you'll get a sense of what the picture actually looks like based on likely voters. So if you take a few minutes to study this chart, you'll find a treasure trove of voter information based on party affiliations. Now, what do state and local governments do? Because the California government, when we talk about California government, we're talking about the state government and local governments, which are created under state law and state constitutional authority. The importance, of course, state and local governments is that that's where the rubber meets the road for almost all citizens. By that we mean that the kinds of things that happen in Washington, D.C. May affect us from time to time in one form or another, but the vast majority of our contact with government occurs at the state and local level. Why? Because that's where we get most of our services. That's where we run our schools. That's where decisions are made on transportation, on land use, on social services, where decisions are made on very important aspects of our lives at the local level. And of course, the states, as we've learned in federalism, regulate public safety, health, morals, and so forth. When we discussed federalism, we talked about state police power. So those are the kinds of things that state and local governments provide at the state and local level. That's why they're far more important in determining what happens in our daily lives than what happens at the federal level. Now let's take a look at the legislative process. And the question, of course, is what is it that the people we elect and send to the California legislature actually do? Well, they actually do a whole lot of things. Of course, their principal job is to pass laws, which means they have to develop bills, they have to draft laws, and navigate them through the legislative process and enact them into law. That, of course, is a pretty enormous task, drafting bills and approving policies, regulations, and studying and implementing or passing budgets and programs is an enormous task, which occupies a great deal of the legislature's time. But in terms of the mechanics of what they do, once they draft a bill, they debate and analyze it, they get critical reviews from it, they hold hearings, a whole bunch of other things, try to get impact analysis of proposed laws, and then they vote on them and try to enact them into law. But through the process, of course, the legislative process is not simply cut and dry. Legislators have to make deals, they have to collaborate and negotiate with each other, they have to resolve differences, they have to come to new agreements. So it's a horse trading kind of a thing, but it's a process that requires a great deal of interaction and a great deal of cooperation with each other to pass laws. There are other things, of course, like seeking funds for projects and programs in their particular district. So each legislator has to bring the bacon home, so to speak. And to do that, of course, they need the support of other legislators, and so the dynamic takes over there. Of course, when the governor send nominees to leadership posts, the legislature has to approve appointments um, and confirm nominees or reject them if they must. Legislators also do serve on committees, on panels, study groups, on policy issues, and so forth. It's not just simply drafting bills and debating it on the floor. There's a whole lot of work that is done outside of the floor in committees and panels and things of that sort. And of course, when they're not doing any of these kinds of things, they're in their offices and their district offices, they have to deal with constituency concerns. People will come in with all kinds of problems, seeking help and intervention, and so they have to do those kinds of things as well. And also to aid them in the work that they do, they have to listen to testimony and conduct hearings and other related activities. So legislators do quite a bit. And that is part of what it requires to implement good and effective laws. Now, California legislative process is a pretty complicated and drawn-out process. There is a legislative procedures handbook. This link I would urge you at least to take a quick look and see what's there, because you'd be impressed by the kind of detail and activities that take place before you enact an idea into law. Just procedurally speaking, the kinds of steps and hoops one must jump and go through to enact the law. The legislative process begins with an idea for a law. That could be an idea to deal with a problem, an issue, or new things, or to change things, and so on and so forth. So the origin of a bill is an idea. And that idea can come from different sources. Sometimes the lawmakers themselves have those ideas. It could be part of their campaign promises. They promise to do one thing or another, and now they will introduce legislation to bring that promise into effect. Oftentimes it would be lobbyists, which we discussed in the last chapter, whose principal interest is to impact public policy, and particularly legislation, and so they will draft legislation that is favorable to their constituents or to their interest groups, and hope to persuade at least one member of the legislature to adopt that and introduce it for passage. But ideas can also come from constituents, individuals and people in the community who may want to enact a certain kind of law or to deal with a certain kind of problem, and legislators could take that and use it as a basis for drafting legislation, and could also be based on some research or study that was completed. So all kinds of sources can provide ideas for legislation. Now, important thing here is that even though these ideas come from different sources, and even when the actual legislation is drafted by some outsiders, only legislators can introduce these ideas in the legislature in a document called bill. And this also holds true for Congress as well. And of course, we've seen how a bill navigates its way to the president's desk. And similarly, we have the same kind of situation for a bill which navigates its way to the governor's desk. So you have the author of the legislation who sends the idea for a bill to the Legislative Council, where it's drafted into an actual bill. So oftentimes there is a professional body within the legislature that takes ideas and notions and so forth, and transforms it into an actual bill. And that is the Legislative Counsel's office. These are legislative drafters, lawyers and researchers and others who are experts in writing legislation. Because writing legislation is a very complicated kind of a task. It requires a certain degree of expertise. And once the Legislative Council drafts the bill, it is returned to the legislature for introduction. And of course, if the author is a state senator, then it's returned to the state senate, and the same for the assembly member. So if we look at the legislative process, this chart kind of gives us an overview of how a bill becomes law. In California, you see at the very top, a bill is introduced. Then it goes to committee hearings, and floor action is taken, which means that a bill is voted upon. And the arrow pointing to committee hearings there would be for the alternate house to the Senate. So depending upon which side you started, it would go to a committee hearing in the alternate house, and then floor action takes place. And if both houses pass the same legislation and they are identical and both have endorsed it, then it is ready to go to the governor's office for his signature. If not, it is returned back to the legislature so they can work on it, or they can, if the governor vetoes it, and if they have 2/3 of both houses to override that, it still becomes law. And if it does become law, either with the signature of the governor or with an override, then the bill becomes effective January 1 of the following year. Now, the California legislature, in the state assembly, we have 80 members who serve a 2-year term. And in the Senate, we have 40 members, and they serve a 4-year term. Until 1990, it used to be that members of the assembly and the Senate could be elected for as many times as they possibly could. But Proposition 140, another good example of direct democracy, the people, the voters, decided that this kind of career politician situation was not very helpful, because many of these members ended up in the pockets of special interests and so forth. And one way to cut down on that was to remove the unlimited service. And so now, under Proposition 140, which is a change in the state constitution, introduced back in 1990, members of the assembly are limited to serve only 3 2-year terms, a total of 6 years, and and senators are limited to 2 4-year terms. Now, that does not mean that's not a lifetime ban. Presumably, they could wait out a term or two and then come back and run for office again. There is no constitutional prohibition on that. Now, one of the side effects of this has been that because of the constant turnover in the Assembly and the Senate, it takes more than 4 or 6 years to become really good at the process of legislation and to develop the kind of expertise in policy areas to become effective. But just as the senator or the state assembly person becomes well tuned to the issues, then Prop 140 kicks in, and then they have to leave. So one has to balance loss of expertise and so forth against the possibility of career politicians not necessarily serving career politicians with unlimited terms, more likely than not in the service of special interests. Here's a sample California State Assembly bill. You recall I showed you one in Supplemental Lecture 1, a bill in Congress. And there are some similarities, but also some differences here, as you can see. it is organized somewhat differently, and it's also structured somewhat differently. You'll notice that it is identified as Assembly Bill and with the number, and it is chaptered. There is no such thing in a bill that Congress passes. The chaptering or codification occurs after the bill has been signed by the President. So here, again, the formal language is required, as we discussed with the bill in the U.S. Congress. And here, the required language, as you can see, identifies the bill with the chapter and where this changes is happening, or this amendment is happening. And as you'll notice there that it states that the purpose of the bill is to amend Section 3351 and so forth of the Labor Code, and to amend Section 606 of the Unemployment Insurance Code relating to thus and so. So that's required language. That's how the bill is identified, and one can readily understand what it's all about. And then that is followed by the Legislative Council's digest. There is no such thing in Congress. There is no Legislative Council digest. It just simply whoever introduced it simply proceeds with the language. But here, since the Legislative Council drafted the legislation as well, but the digest provides an independent and impartial analysis of what the law is all about. And here it talks about the bill, it deals with worker status, employees, and so on and so forth. Basically provides a detailed analysis of the change, the amendment, and possibly even the impact. The main body of the bill, you'll see on the right-hand side, says the people of the state of California do enact as follows, and then it goes on by section, subsection, and things of that sort. Here in Section 1, it makes a legislative finding, namely that on April 30th, 2018, Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision in such and such a case, and then it goes on to identify what the issues and problems are, and how this bill is going to address those issues. So oftentimes these bills become very detailed and complicated. So the first thing that happens to a bill in the state legislature is that it gets its first reading, and that's its first introduction. You recall that a bill is dropped in the hopper in Congress, or at least in the House of Representatives, and it begins its journey there. But here, it starts with a first reading, and first reading simply means that the bill is introduced or read for the first time, and the reading part of it really is not reading of the entire language or provisions in the bill. It just simply read the first time by identifying it by bill number, the name of the author, and the descriptive title of the bill, and that is read on the floor, and that's the formal introduction of the bill. Then the bill is sent to the Office of State Printing, which will then prepare it in the proper form and so on, and returned. And the rule is that once a bill has been read the first time, it may not be acted upon until 30 days have passed from the date of its introduction. That will allow members to get copies of the law, to learn about it, and to be informed and so on. So no one will be able to sneak anything by. It maintains transparency. And also provide the opportunity, because many bills are introduced, and so it would be hard to keep track, but at least if you have 30 days, the staffers can pick up on it if it's especially an important issue. Once it's been introduced, then it is referred for committee hearings, and there are, just like in the U.S. Congress, many committees, depending upon the policy issue and the area of law. It will be referred to those committees. But here, the Rules Committee of the Senate Assembly, where it is assigned to the appropriate policy committee for its first hearing. So the traffic cops would be the Rules Committee in both houses that will direct that piece of legislation to the appropriate committee, so that it will now be more fully studied and considered. Therefore, bills are assigned to policy committees according to subject area. If it's an education bill, it will be referred to an education committee, or health and transportation and so forth. Now, bills that require expenditure of funds must also be heard in the fiscal committees. So that would be the Senate Appropriations and Assembly Appropriations Committee, because that requires expenditure of tax dollars, and therefore the fiscal impact must be assessed. And so these are committees that specialize in fiscal impact analysis. Now, during the committee hearings in these committees, the author presents the bill to the committee, and then it's opened for testimony to be heard in support or opposition of the bill. Oftentimes, the committee chair will try to arrange for experts and proponents and opponents of the legislation to come in and share their concerns and ideas and explanations and things of that sort. And that is very important, because committee members in the legislature are not experts in all areas of policy. They certainly may have some general ideas, but overall they need the assistance of others with specialized knowledge and people who are likely to be impacted. So they have a deeper and more intense appreciation of the issues than simply trying to decide on their own. And that's why the committee hearings are very important. And once the committee has heard and made changes and amendments and so forth, then the committee will vote, and they can vote to pass the bill over to the floor directly, or they can pass the bill as amended, or they can vote down the bill. But once it is in committee, it is really in the hands of the committee chair and the majority on that committee to determine the outcome of that piece of legislation. Now, the main things, of course, is that once the author has presented it, others will have other ideas about the law, because that law could impact different segments of the community or the population differently, and so everybody has something to say. And so the committee will necessarily make amendments. They will make changes and modifications, and they can do that as many times as they think is necessary or warranted. And if there are parties who want to support or oppose the legislation, they can write letters. They can contact particular legislators on the committees and ask either to be heard or to provide information or data that will be helpful in crafting that legislation. It takes a majority vote of the full committee membership for a bill to be passed by the committee, so it's a simple majority. And each house maintains schedule of its legislative committee hearings. And prior to a bill's hearing, a bill analysis is prepared that explains the current law, what the bill is intended to do, and some background information, and also list organizations that support or oppose it. So it's part of the legislative process at the state level, which is quite different from what happens in Congress. Then the bill will have to undergo a second and third reading. So bills passed by committees are read for a second time on the floor in the Senate or in the Assembly, and then the bill analysis also prepared prior to the third reading. So what it means to have a third reading is that the bill is explained by the author, discussed by the members, and voted on by a roll call vote. So the third reading is where the rubber meets the road. And that's when the legislators will have a final say on that piece of legislation. Now, bills that require an appropriation or expenditure of money, or that take effect immediately, Generally require 27 votes in the Senate and 54 votes in the Assembly to be passed. But generally speaking, most bills require a bare majority, 21 out of 40 senators and 41 out of 80 Assembly members. Now, if a bill is defeated, a member may seek reconsideration and another vote. That's also one of the differences with Congress. And then, of course, once the third reading occurs and it's passed by a majority on the floor, then it is sent to the other house where it begins its journey again in committee process, and essentially goes through the readings and so forth, and is voted upon. And once the bill has been approved by the House of Origin, and if there are differences resolved through a conference committee, then the bill is prepared or ready for the governor's signature. Here's an example of an analysis of a bill, which I mentioned in the previous slide. And here, as you can see, and also original bill, and it identifies the author and the analyst and the attorney overseeing this and so forth, and identifies the subject. In this case, it's about low-income housing, farm worker housing credit, and so on. And the analysis provides a summary. This bill would, under personal income law, do this, that, and the other. And then it will indicate the limitations of the analysis. In this case, the analysis addresses only the provisions of the bill that impact the department's programs and operations. And then it makes a recommendation. In this case, the analyst takes no position. And then we'll discuss the reasons for the bill and the effective operative date and things like that. So when a legislator looks at this analysis, he or she may not necessarily need to go through 30, 40 pages or even more to understand what the bill is all about. They get a quick understanding, and if there are things that are not clear, then they can look at the legislation for more details. Here is what I was referring to about resolution of differences. If a bill is amended in the second house, whichever one it may be, it's very similar to what happens in Congress. Then it must go back to the House of Origin for concurrence, which is an agreement on the amendments. And even though in Congress they use conference committees to resolve these kinds of differences, but the idea is to bring both houses on the same page, as it were. Now, if agreement cannot be reached, then the bill will be referred to a two-house conference committee to resolve differences in much the same way as Congress. 3 members of the committee are from the Senate and 3 from the Assembly, and then they try to reach a compromise and iron out any differences. And then if the bill is returned to both houses and is passed, then it's presented to the governor for his signature. And once it gets to the governor's desk, he or she has several options. The governor may sign the bill into law, in which case that would be the end of that bill as a bill and now becomes a law. Or he can allow it to become law without his or her signature. Or the governor can veto it, which is somewhat different from the legislative process we've seen in Congress. But if the governor decides to veto, that veto can be overridden by 2/3 vote in both houses, very similar to Congress. But if a bill is signed, then it will go into effect, as I indicated earlier, on the first day of January of the next year. Unless, of course, it's an urgency measure, which must take effect immediately after it is signed into law, or becomes law without the governor's signature. Now, once the law has been signed, the bills that are passed by the legislature and approved by the governor are then assigned a chapter number by the Secretary of State. So this would be part of the codification. It becomes part of the existing system of codified laws in the state. And these chapter bills, also referred to as statute of the year, they were enacted, then become part of the California codes. And there's California Criminal Code, there's California Labor Code, and Employment Code, all kinds of codes, and becomes it is chaptered in one of those. So the California codes are a comprehensive collection of laws grouped by subject matter, and that's how these laws would ultimately be lodged and found. Now there are a bunch of other activities that legislators can engage in during the legislative process. A bill may be amended, that means changed, at any time during the process. It can be withdrawn. The author may, for whatever reason, remove the bill from consideration. Could be stuck in committee, in which case the committee chair refuses to allow the bill to come up for a vote or consideration. That effectively kills it. Or it could be held over as a 2-year bill, in which case the author takes the bill out of consideration during the first year and try to introduce it in the second. A bill is set to be enrolled when it is sent to the governor for action. So from a draft bill to an enrolled bill to a law once it is signed by the governor. Here is the general calendar of the legislative process. They start January, February. Bills are introduced in their house of origin during these 2 months, and most of the bills go to the Legislative Counsel's office, where they are drafted into formal legislative language during this period. So you can't just simply introduce it. It has to be done within a certain time frame, January and February. And the deadline for introducing bills to be heard that year is the end of the 3rd week of February. So if you haven't introduced anything by then it's unlikely that you're going to have any. So you must meet the deadline. Bill, of course, is then given first reading in the House, and from March to April, bills are heard through their respective policy committees, and then bills with fiscal impact must be out by the beginning of May, out of committee, and bills without fiscal impact by the 2nd week of May. So everything is pretty well regimented. And in May, the fiscal committees in the House of origin hear those bills. The last week of May, the bills go to the floor, and they are voted on by the full House. Between June and August, the process is repeated in the other House. June to mid-August in policy committees. Second half of August, consideration by fiscal committees, and by September, floor sessions are held in both houses. And all bills must be out of the legislature and to the governor's desk by the end of the 2nd week of September. And the governor will have until the end of September to act on these bills, which is very, very different than the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress is not regimented with such very rigid kind of timelines. It is more or less as things come along. Let's talk a little bit about the California budget process before we conclude. Again, the budget process, of course, is where the legislature has to make a decision how to fund state operations. That also is very strictly regimented between July 9th, September 15th. That's when department directors, agency heads, and so forth begin their reviews and proposals for development. And begin to refine their request for each program. Then these requests are sent to the Department of Finance for review. Again, time structured. Between October and January, the governor evaluates the request as reviewed by the Department of Finance, sends the proposed budget to the legislature. Then between January and February, the budget proposal is introduced in both houses as identical budget bills, and the legislative analyst prepares an extensive analysis of the budget bill, which then becomes a starting point for budget subcommittee hearings in the State Assembly. Between March and April, the budget bills are sent from each out to the respective budget committees. The bills are then broken down by subject and assigned the appropriate subcommittees by subject areas. Then late April to June 15, also called the May Revise, the budget committee of each house considers the subcommittee's reports and sends the revised budget bill to the floor for evaluation by the full body. Each house discusses and then votes on its version of the budget bill, and then the differences between the two versions of the budget are worked out in the conference committee, just as indicated in the previous slide. And then each chamber will vote on the final version of the bill before it's sent to the governor. And then between July 15 and July 1, the governor gets the budget and has until July 1, the start of the fiscal year, to sign or veto the budget bill. And the bill becomes law as soon as it's signed by the governor. But it's not as easy as that. Passing the California budget has been very, very difficult. It's been increasingly difficult to pass budgets. And the reason for that is that you need 2/3 of the majority to approve it. And getting those 2/3 approvals have not been very easy for a variety of factors. And in 2008, the record budget tardiness, in other words, they could not come up with a budget in 2008 until 85 days late than that they were required to. And in 2010, trying to fix a $19 billion deficit, it took them 78 days. So it's a very complicated process. And this ends the supplemental lecture on California State Legislature. Thank you for watching. And we are now exactly at 59 minutes. And it's a pleasure having you. Until next time, stay well. Thanks again.